Thank you all so much for joining. Welcome to today's Birds of the World Discovery Series webinar, hosted by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. My name is Allie Smith. I will be hosting today, speaking to you all from Ithaca, New York. And here with me behind the scenes is Jessica Kane, who will be monitoring the chat and helping out throughout. Hey, Jessica, thank you so much.
Thank you
Today,
for helping us out, Allie.
Today, we have three expert panelists who will take us on a deep dive into AviList, which is a unified global avian checklist that provides the most current and authoritative taxonomy of birds. AviList was released just last month in June 2025 by experts in taxonomy, nomenclature, and bioinformatics, including researchers from here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, from the American Ornithological Society, BirdLife International, the International Ornithologists Union, and Avibase, among many others. So before we get started, we have a couple of tech-related announcements to make. This webinar will last 90 minutes. We have 90 minutes scheduled. We're going to aim for about an hour of panelist discussion and then 30 minutes of questions afterwards. So if you do have questions at any time, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. We will have time for our panelists to answer some of these questions at the end of the webinar. Just make sure you put those in the Q&A section down at the bottom, and then that'll make them available for a panelist to answer later. Closed captioning is available in multiple languages. You can just click the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and if you need a translation, you can find that under the More button. And finally, this webinar will be recorded, and it will be sent out about a week or so after this is over. So now let me introduce today's panel. Panelists, could you all please turn on your cameras? Our three panelists today are all members of the executive committee of AviList. So joining us today are Dr. Pam Rasmussen, Senior Research Associate for Birds of the World at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We also have Marshall Iliff, Project Lead for eBird at the Cornell Lab, and Dr. Paul Donald, Senior Scientist at BirdLife International. Today's webinar is made up of 5 parts, all led by these 3 panelists. First, we will go through an overview of the history of taxonomy. Then we'll discuss the goals of AviList, how it's set up, why it's important. Then we'll discuss the roles and perspectives of bird life in this project. Then we have some interesting cases regarding species concepts to share. And then finally, we'll end with AviList's impact on birding tools and resources like eBird and Birds of the World. So that's a lot to cover. We're going to aim for about an hour of discussion from our panelists and a half hour at the end for questions. And as a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A. And if you want to listen to this again later, the recording of this webinar will be available next week. So let's just jump in and get started. I'm going to hand it over to Pam to introduce us to taxonomy. Pam, if you'd like to start sharing your screen and turn your camera on.
Hello, I'm very pleased to be here to share our project AviList with you. And I'm assuming that that you're seeing my screen, right?
Correct, yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's introduce AviList. So most of you probably have a pretty good idea what a checklist is. It basically is a list of all the birds of the world, but not everyone will be really familiar with taxonomy and nomenclature and what checklists are actually based on. So let's go through that a little bit. I know this will be familiar to many of you, but checklists are not just a random list of all the birds of the world. They're based on the taxonomy, which is the classification of organisms in which their evolutionary relationships, as best as we know them, are arranged in linear order. And we'll be using the term taxa to refer to multiple organisms, and taxon is the singular. And taxa can refer to organisms at any level. It's not just species. Sometimes people get that confused. So just to be clear, a genus is a taxon as well as a species. And once we know the classification, then we need to assign names to organisms, or when we're describing them to science, they get a name, and that is what we call nomenclature. Taxonomy and nomenclature goes hand in hand, and a known organism has a scientific name following the Linnaean system, and that will also place it in the hierarchical system and give it a binomial, which just means two names in the Linnaean system, like Homo sapiens and Turdus migratorius. And there is a very strict set of rules that have to be followed from the ICZN, which is International Commission for Zoological Nomenclature, when applying and using scientific names. We won't go into the details. We could be here all day just doing that. And then organisms, at least birds, also have English names. Not every organism has an English name. Birds, many species of birds have hundreds of English names, but one that is generally accepted by at least each checklist. And now we're working on standardizing them even more. Anyway, so English names are often sort of mysterious in how they originated. And some of them you find that, like the name Gadwall for the familiar gray duck, we don't know where it came from, but we know it's been around a really long time. The name Mallard has an origin that apparently isn't really what it is, the way it's now used, but it's very, very entrenched. So it's certainly historically based and not likely to be changed anytime soon. And we often have regulation of English names by regional bodies, but there isn't like an international commission for English names. Here's a couple of examples of English names that are used in Clements and the scientific names, and also the hierarchical classification. So every bird, you can do this for every bird. Well, I think most of you are probably especially interested in species, like which species are going to be lumped and which species are going to be split. That's our experience, is that that's what people are most interested in. But why is that? Well, species are the units that are most used in these aspects. Scientific study. Some studies may be based on population. Some studies may be based on genera or families, but most are based on species. And for conservation planning and action, most of those are based on species, and generally subspecies get less priority in those aspects, those very important aspects. I'll let Paul talk more about BirdLife's application, and even in law enforcement. So species are used for the trade, etc., and subspecies may get short shrift. And then, of course, for many of you, birding is the main thing. And of course, we list species. We don't generally list other taxa. Here's an example of a recent split that was done by North American Checklist Committee, and really makes a huge difference to the status of these birds now, because formerly they were two islands. Now in Martinique, they're only found on one small peninsula, and in St. Lucia, they're also quite restricted. But so finding that they're not conspecific, despite their obvious similarities, is very, very important to their species, their conservation. And how do we define species? Well, there are two main species concepts. There are many others as well, but these are the two main ones: phylogenetic species concept, or PSC, and the biological species concept, or BSC. And they differ quite a bit in terms of how they're defined. Phylogenetic species concept is a terminal branch on a tree that's distinctive, has diagnostic characters shared through common descent. Whereas biological species concepts is organisms that can interbreed with each other, but not with other groups of organisms. And many of the same species will be recognized whichever concept you use, but not all of them by any means. Maybe 2/3 more are recognized by the PSC. It's a historical fact that the avian taxonomic lists follow the BSC. There are some committees, regional committees, that do follow the PSC. Here's an example of a recent four-way split that probably affects many of your life lists, that would probably be the same whether you're using a BSC or a PSC framework. but there are many others that would not be the case for. So how did we get to the point of needing a unified checklist? Well, let's go back in history a little bit and look at Peters' checklist, which started in 1931 with James L. Peters' monumental work that ended up being in several volumes that far exceeded his lifespan, which ended about here. And they were enacting for the first time broadly among birds the biological species concept. And their approach was that if it could reasonably be considered a subspecies of something, it would be. Whether it differed in a lot of ways or not, they were pretty what we call conservative in making those decisions. And in each case, each volume, the first several solely by Peters, and then others took over the job when he passed away. And usually it was just one person or two people making the decisions. And at that time, of course, they didn't have bioacoustics and they didn't have genetics to work with. So what they had was massive collections of museum specimens, which give a pretty good basis for making species level decisions, but imperfect, of course. And they often also took the tack of, just because they were doing this work on a tight time scale, and at that time, this was how you did things. You just made decisions and you didn't have to justify them. So we now find that many of what we now question as being species rather than subspecies, they had lumped without publishing any explanation. Well, we now have these tools, bioacoustics and genetics, in large, huge scale now. And we now know that many of these decisions are obsolete. In fact, only according to a calculation by Denis Lepage, only about 4,400 avian species have not changed taxonomically over the past 40 years. So then let me go to this slide. I'll come back to that one. Then we had a period of less stability because we had 4 major global avian checklists develop. And each of them was done by a different team, and each of them had slightly different standards in terms of what constituted the sufficient burden of proof to consider something a subspecies or a species, whether a trait scoring system was adopted, in this case with the HBW BirdLife, and whether peer-reviewed publication is necessary for enactment of a species split. And that was basically adopted by Howard and Moore. The others, of course, prefer to have that, but in some cases made decisions on other bases. And importantly, they were updated on different timetables. And that, I think Marshall's going to talk more about that. So here's a couple of examples. I won't go into the details, but for example, the Eurasian jay, which has many, many subspecies, was split into 3 species by HBW, Handbook of Birds of the World and BirdLife, but the others retained them as a single species. It won't stay that way forever because we know that there's a lot of geographic variation, genetic and vocal, et cetera, and we just don't have a sufficient amount to make those decisions. But BirdLife felt that they did, based on their 7-point system. And in another example, the little shrike thrush of Australia and New Zealand is extremely variable in various shades of earth tones, but based on a molecular study, it was split into 7 species by eBird and Clements and IOC, but retained as 1 by Howard and Moore and BirdLife International. So we had major discrepancies in both of these cases and many, many, many others. And again, this isn't a final word, but it's the status of these birds in these checklists. Okay, so here we have the development of these 4 major checklists, and each was widely adopted. There are others, like on the internet, et cetera, that haven't been so widely adopted. And the problem is, well, there's actually one advantage, at least, of having the multiple checklists. that diversity of approach does highlight areas of uncertainty where research is needed, for sure. But there's so many negative consequences. For example, how do you regulate something like a myna that comes from a small island? If it's like it would be critically endangered if considered to be a separate species, but if it's considered part of the same species, it's not. So this causes a huge problem. Marshall and Paul will talk more about that. And again, Marshall's going to talk more about this, but GenBank is an example of a very important resource that has lots and lots of problems with data quality, partly due to taxonomic uncertainty. And then, of course, for birding, which affects many of our audience, I'm sure. You've probably been on birding tours where there was argument over whether something's a species or not, whether you needed to try to see it or not, or sometimes knowing how to enter into eBird, et cetera, or iNaturalist can be a big problem if there's different names and concepts. And again, Marshall's going to talk more about that. And I'm turning it over to Marshall now.
You're muted, Marshall.
Okay, how's that? Unmuted. So Pam's really given a great outline of what taxonomy is, what the history is, and what some of the problems are with this proliferation of multiple global checklists that we have. And AviList, which as Ali said, was just released in June, was really formed as an attempt to answer some of those problems, to try to build consensus around what the global checklist of birds is, what names to use, and to try to really build that consensus across the planet and across all the practitioners that work with bird data, from eBird to BirdLife to field guide authors to federal governments, et cetera. And I've been in the role helping to manage eBird since 2007, and one of the challenges we just constantly see is people being confused because they use the IOC checklist or the BirdLife checklist, but then they're trying to find that bird in eBird and it's got a different name and maybe it's been split. And with all these different things, it really was and remains a major data quality issue for us that wastes the time of our volunteer reviewers. It sometimes has erroneous records sneak through and have us misrepresent the understanding of birds and where they occur, and just frustrations for people sort of all around when someone writes and says, you put in the wrong bird, and they say, but it's what my field guide says, what my local guide said. So AviList was sort of born out of discussions between the IOC team, especially Frank Gill, the eBird team, the BirdLife team, and really goes back to the AOS meeting in DC in 2016. We all sat around and said the IOU Congress is coming up in Vancouver in 2 years, and this is going to be a great opportunity to maybe get all these players in the same room together and try to figure out, can we do this better? Can we have more efficiency by really having a single team that's assessing this taxonomy, and arriving at better decisions on a sort of more consistent timetable. The initial approach was to actually try this with waterfowl and say, okay, how would we actually do this? And so we actually took all the world's waterfowl, looked at all the places where the checklist differed, and sort of did a pilot study where we said, okay, let's try to resolve the waterfowl. And that was really informative for us for sort of how this process might work. And that led to a roundtable discussion at the 2018 Vancouver conference that had representatives from IOU, IOC, AOS, eBird Clements, Howard and Moore, Avibase. I don't think there was anyone from BirdLife there, but we were in touch immediately after. So we basically had all the players in the room in Vancouver, and we were able to sit down and sort of come up with a plan. Still took a couple years to get all our ducks in a row to actually start doing it, but right around the start, sort of in the middle of the pandemic, for better or worse, probably had taxonomists that had a lot of time to start addressing this. We started in earnest looking at incongruences between the checklists that were part of this. So Howard and Moore had opted out to basically continue publishing their independent checklist, but that meant that we still had eBird Clements from the Cornell Lab, BirdLife International checklist that's tied to the Red List, Avibase, which is managed by Denis Lepage and really is a system for matching checklists together. The IOC World Bird List, and the AOS North American Classification Committee and South American Classification Committee were all part of this effort. So we looked at all the places where a different split was enacted by any one of those checklists, a different lump was enacted, a different name was used, and in any case where like a subspecies was assigned to a different species between those checklists. We went through every single one. It was over 1,000 sort of sets of issues to check out. We had sort of a system using GitHub and discussions and back and forth, and Pam and Paul and the other taxonomists would sort of like pull up papers and images and assessments of vocal information and sort of basically like get all the information in one place for what's the justification for this treatment versus this one. And it was a 4-year process that basically wrapped up in 2024. And then we were able to finalize, publish the list, and get this website out in June. So really a lot of work to assess all these differences between the checklists, but the result is that basically all the top priority places where someone has advanced a different hypothesis for the taxonomy we have now assessed, and that gives us a starting point to sort of move forward with this global checklist. Really important for that is governance and having a good terms of reference. So if you go to the website, you can see sort of all the ways we're expecting to have this group operate. You know, how the committees are formed, how we sort of expect a structure of committees to feed into the overarching process, and also very significant. Just this month, the paper that basically describing this effort and this process has just been published with all the people that have been involved on various levels in this. So really describing sort of why we need this and what we've done and how we see it going forward in the future. So we do have this sort of system of structure. There's an executive committee that really tries to focus on the big picture questions. That committee has sort of been active throughout to try to figure out how are we actually going to do this? How are we going to get it out the door? What types of support can we get from different organizations? And has helped to define the terms of reference and get the paper out the door. And then under that, we sort of have the taxonomic or sort of the different tasks chunked out into the taxonomic committee that really Pam will focus a lot on sort of the types of decisions that are in the taxonomic realm, but really like what are the species limits, what are the scientific names that are used for those. And then bibliographic and nomenclatural committee focuses on sort of like that very specific aspect of understanding what name first described a given taxon and how that was published and sort of the formal ways of defining these names. Basically, this whole process is tying like a taxonomic entity to a name that's been published. That's really what an avian checklist is, or any checklist of life. And then I chair the technical committee, which is really thinking like, how do we use databases and websites to help both run this process, keep the information in a database, and get it out to the public through the website. The piece that's coming online now is really to broaden the scope of this by having regional groups that can really sort of be primarily responsible for their avifauna in a given region, a region people know well and do a lot of field work. These are independent groups. They're basically tasked with send us a proposal for a change. If we have a problem with our Western hooded pitta taxonomy up at the top left, we would ask the tropical Asian group to take a look at our classification, point out any problems, summarize those, and send a recommendation to to the taxonomic committee, which would then assess those. And the reason we have a taxonomic committee that sort of overarches this globally is really to bring consistency, because if we sort of had each of these groups make their own decisions for their regions, first off, there's taxa that might be global, might touch on all these regions, but also we really want to make sure that we have one committee that's as applying these decisions as consistently as possible around the world. So we hope that this process will really set up to bring the best of the expertise that each of these regional groups has to offer, and also feed into a process that will really bring consistency. The two that weren't on that previous slide are North America and South America, and that's because those have these long-standing committees. North American committee has been in place since the 1800s, publishing the AOU checklist, now the AOS checklist, and then South American Classification Committee, really under the leadership of Van Remsen, but involving a lot of ornithologists from across South America, has been an online publication since 1998 and really focused on the classification of birds in South America. So both of those sort of officially feed in as the advisory groups for North America and South America. And both have a certain amount of independence. They still continue to publish their lists, but there's so much more interchange of information now that really these are operating as entities that are really trying to keep in sync with the global checklist that AviList is producing. And so then we have these 4 checklists that sort of started this, that on Pam's slide were those red boxes that sort of create this problem of all this confusion over bird names. So those of us at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the taxonomy that we have is basically the backbone of all the products that we provide, and that includes eBird, Merlin, Birds of the World, All About Birds, eBird Status and Trends. So basically the whole Cornell Lab database is driven by this eBird Clements taxonomy. That's been updated once annually. We will continue to do those updates, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at a later point. But that has almost completely aligned with AviList as of this point, and we'll get even closer in the next year or two. IOC World Bird List was really sort of the starting point. It was our baseline taxonomy for AviList, and sort of we made all the changes to that as we've gone. IOC, like Clements, has been actively updating to converge on the AviList taxonomy. But the final update will be next month. That'll be IOC version 15.2. Pam Rasmussen is also part of the IOC team, and will help with putting out that final list, which won't be an exact mirror of AviList, but will be an update that takes the final version of that list very, very close. Paul will talk about the BirdLife taxonomy, but that also has been converging, and has a lot of work in the next few years to sort of finalize that convergence. But it's a long process for BirdLife because of the importance of sort of international law and the IUCN Red List. And then Howard and Moore continues to be sort of independent. Their last published version was in 2014, so that book is quite a bit out of date at this point. They do have a website that has done some intermittent updates. Since they're not part of the team, I don't know exactly their plans, but that may continue to be an independent World Bird List that hopefully won't be too different, but we'll see. That's sort of up to that team. So we've been sort of dividing this AviList process into 2 phases. Phase 1 was this big project to look at all the incongruences between the lists. So all the places where the species and names differ. That's the piece that completed with the publication of the first version. Phase 2 is sort of what we're starting now, which is like, let's keep this going for annual updates and bring in these regional groups. So phase 1 finally published on 11th of June. The website is now out. You can download the global bird list. There's sort of a long and short version. The long version has 26 data fields. The short version has sort of the more essential ones of the names and ranges and families and things for each one. In the process, we considered over 1,000 sort of separate issues, which might have involved 3,000 different taxa or 4,000 different taxa. And that has formally assessed all the species limits, all the genera, all the families and orders, the nomenclature, any cases where those have differed, those have been assessed. The subspecies have not been assessed. The subspecies baseline is from the IOC World Bird List. A phase 2 project will be to assess the subspecies. The ranges are straight from the eBird Clements checklist. Pam, again, has really taken a major role in making sure that those sync up between eBird Clements, and AviList. The list also includes IUCN Red List status in all the places where the taxa are aligned and we can provide it. And it includes a lot of bibliographic data, sort of the first modern checklist to do that since Peters, that has links to the original bird names, type localities, original descriptions, bibliographic details. That's very much a work in progress, but has really abundant information in there. And the links to original descriptions are really nice because they go to these old publications where a name was originally described, really helpful for sort of taxonomic work and just people curious about ornithological history. So the real goal has been to have these checklists align. And I pulled out some of the numbers for the blue line here is the species total on the checklist, and then the green line is the alignment. So these are taxa that are 100% the same between AviList and IOC. The orange line up here could be confusing. It sort of looks like AviList has had a constant taxonomy since 2019. That's not actually true. This is just the baseline that we hit in 2025 with the publication of this list. So that's sort of the total that these lists have been aligning towards. And you can see IOC is very nicely converging on this AviList. As these two lines come together, it shows it's basically converging on AviList. For eBird, it's been much more important for us to align. So we've aligned much more aggressively. We are well over 99% in agreement with AviList at this moment, and it'll be even closer to 100% in our October update. And by 2026, we expect essentially no differences between the two. And then there's sort of the line of movement for all these on the same graph. And if we look at BirdLife, it basically is doing the same thing and would also be converging around this AviList total. So just to sort of return to the problems that Pam laid out, GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, is basically like the data clearinghouse for all forms of life. So all museum specimens feed into GBIF, all eBird observations feed into GBIF, all INAT observations feed into GBIF, and tons of other scientific projects around the world feed into GBIF. But if we look down here at the bottom left, we see the problem that we have when taxonomies are confused. So Gallinula chloropus is the bird that in eBird we call common moorhen or Eurasian moorhen. And it only occurs in the Palearctic and Africa. So all those points you see for North America, that's actually a different species. That's Gallinula galliata, which we call common gallinule over here. Could also be American moorhen or laughing moorhen, or names that have been used for that. But it's fully agreed upon by all the world bird lists to be a different species. But that was a fairly recent decision within the past 10 years. And so we have this legacy just because of the way scientific nomenclature works. Gallinula chloropus referred to the North American birds more than 10 years ago. And we see this long footprint of that confusion in this major data clearinghouse for birds of the world. If you look on the right, we have them split out properly in eBird. So Galliata is only in the New World, only in North America, South America. Chloropus is only in Eurasia and Africa. And that's really what we'd like to see showing up on the GBIF map also. But it just shows how these taxonomy can be really confused when you're exchanging information through cyberspace. And if you try to match it up on names, you will go wrong very, very often. And that just relates right back to Linnaeus 1758 and the rules that were put in place for how those names are defined. So it almost creates more confusion than it solves when you're trying to exchange information based on names. When you're exchanging it based on sort of taxonomic identifiers, which is the approach that we're really doing, then it solves it. So just another example of where we have this problem of plugging different data sets together. Birds of the World, hosting this webinar, has published species accounts for all the birds in the world. And one of the key sort of baseline pieces of information is that green LC information there. That I've talked about this a couple of times. That's the IUCN red list, and LC means least concern. We can show that for Visayan Shama and white-browed Shama because those are species that we already 100% agree with BirdLife on that name and what population is defined by that name. However, white rump Shama also appears in both bird lists, but eBird has adopted the AviList split that splits that up into white crowned Shama, Maratua Shama, Larwo Shama, Sri Lankan Shama. So the fact that we divide white rump Shama into 5 or 6 species is different from how BirdLife defines it, which means that the red list assessment has not happened for either the bird that they know as white rump Shama, or that we know as white rump Shama, or Maratua Shama, which is one of the splits. Maratua Shama is a very localized island endemic off Borneo and critically endangered by any measure. So once we can sort of get eBird, Birds of the World, operating in the exact same taxonomy as BirdLife, then this information will be solved and sort of better plugged together over cyberspace, which Paul will talk about.
Thanks very much indeed, Marshall. I've turned my camera on, but it seems to think it's got a part-time job, and today is one of its days off, so I may appear yet, but thanks very much. So I think you and Pam have covered probably most of what I was going to say, but I just want to give a little bit of perspective why a purely conservation organization like BirdLife International is so invested in this process of taxonomy. Where's my side? So in case I'm sure you've all heard of BirdLife International, even if you don't know the details, we're a global partnership of bird conservation organizations with one, occasionally 2 partners in each of the countries there in green, a number of affiliate partners in blue, and a number of regional offices around the world marked with the red dots there, and a global secretariat based in Cambridge, UK. And the aim of BirdLife really is to facilitate the flow of resources and information between bird conservation organizations around the world. And we have, until recently, as both Pam and Marshall mentioned, maintained our own independent taxonomy based upon the Handbook of the Birds of the World series, but then updated and with various other tweaks, which I'll talk about in a minute. We're currently on working version 9. And the BirdLife taxonomy is the one that underpins the IUCN Red List for birds. So BirdLife is the IUCN Red List authority for birds. So it's the green and the red and the orange marks that Marshall was just talking about. They apply only to the species concepts as they are recognized by BirdLife International, which means they don't necessarily match up with things like eBird. And of course, that's obviously a problem. And it also underpins all our species and site-based conservation. So, for example, important bird areas, IBAs, and key biodiversity areas, KBAs, they're based upon species level criteria and the species of the species as they are recognized by BirdLife International. And the BirdLife taxonomy is also followed by a number of major international agreements. Convention on Migratory Species, the African Eurasian Waterbirds Agreement, the EU Birds Directive, and so forth, all use the BirdLife taxonomy, which means their taxonomy doesn't match up with, say, the eBird data. And as with Clements and IOC, we update our taxonomy on an annual basis to reflect the latest lumps and splits, the latest research and new discoveries, but we don't necessarily update it in the same way that IOC and Clements have done. So this shows the number of species recognized by the BirdLife list since 2007. You'll see that there's 2 kind of big steps up there in 2014 and 2016, and these coincided with the publications of the Handbook of the Birds of the World and BirdLife International Illustrated Checklist of the World. And these applied, you may remember Pam talking about a points-based system. These applied, in some cases, a points-based system to assess species limits. And they ended up splitting quite a lot of species that were previously lumped. So BirdLife was unique when we were discussing the various mismatches. Quite a lot of them related to species that recognized by BirdLife, but not by IOC or Clements. And quite a lot of those were arrived at through the application of these quantitative criteria. But as both Pam and Marshall have said, we're one of a number of checklists. We're one of 3 major annually updated checklists. Howard and Moore isn't updated annually. And we have had these numerous problems that Marshall's enumerated, that we've been out of sync with other lists for quite a long time. So when AviList came along, we decided that we were going to throw our hats into that particular ring. We've been involved in AviList, not quite from the very start, but at least from the start of the kind of executive process. And BirdLife sits on both the executive and taxonomic committees of AviList. And we have taken the decision that we will align fully with AviList, just as IOC and Clements have done. But it will take us some time to do that. We estimate currently somewhere like 2 to 3 years. And the reason for that is that every change to our checklist involves a whole load of downstream work, because we will then have to assess every new species concept against the IUCN Red List criteria. And that's a very complex process. It involves a process of consultation, huge amounts of work. It can take a whole week just to process one particular change. And the scale of the problem facing our Red List team is really quite huge. I mean, these are some of the AviList decisions that affect us. So island thrush, AviList has split this into 17 different species, whereas previously all of the checklist regarded as a single species. Olive-backed sunbird, 7 species. Rufous antpitter requires us to split it into 7 species. I think it required Clements to split it into even more species. Glossy swiftlet, 8 species. So this is just 4 cases, and we've already amassed 39 new species concepts that our Red List team have to assess. So that's why BirdLife will take a few years to align fully with AviList, but we will do it as quickly as we possibly can. And the benefits for BirdLife are really the same kind of benefits that Marshall and Pam have outlined already. As far as we're concerned, the burden of annually updating our checklist will be shared. We know that we have fallen behind. We don't have enough resources internally to keep up with the huge amount of taxonomic publications coming out each year. We know that updates will be more systematic and more comprehensive than we've been able to achieve in the past. And what we'll see is a much better linking of data. And one of the big goals for us is now that once we've aligned, then eBird data, which could be fantastically useful to us in terms of red listing, in terms of IBA designation and IBA monitoring and so forth, that will then be fully synced with our taxonomy. So these are huge benefits to us. So we will have a lot of work to do in the next few years. We may not agree with all the changes that we're making, but the benefits will certainly outweigh the costs. And I always finish talks about taxonomy with this slightly strange slide. This is the Titanic. And I remember some years ago, somebody saying to me, well, why is a conservation organization like BirdLife investing resources in the sort of fine science of taxonomy? Isn't it a bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? And this is kind of quite a common phrase in the UK. Rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It kind of means that you're doing something futile in the face of an impending disaster. People are saying, oh, the conservation crisis is urgent. Species are going extinct on a daily basis. Why are you wasting your time looking at taxonomy? And I think that the opposite is true. I think that taxonomy is absolutely fundamental to conservation. And I think if you want an analogy involving the Titanic, it's an exercise in working out how many lifeboats we need. Because I think you can't answer the question, which species are most in need of conservation assistance, without first answering the question, which species? And that's why we're absolutely wedded to this process. We can see tremendous advantages for us down the line, even though it will require a few years of some uncertainty. But we're very pleased to be part of the AviList process. That's all I was going to say. Can I hand back? Am I handing back to Pamela now?
Yeah. So let me
I
see.
think you can take over my.
Okay. I assume my sharing is working.
Yeah.
Okay. So back to how decisions are made and on what basis. We talked a little bit already about species concepts and the fact that Peters used the BSC. He and his colleagues recognized in the end 8,906 species, and that depends how you count, because there were 2 editions of volume 1 that differed somewhat. So that's an approximate number. But the fact is that all 4 of the major global checklists have adopted the PSC. The PSC does have a lot of proponents, and there are arguments that are certainly valid as to why the PSC has more relevance in some ways than the BSC. It also has many operational problems, and for whatever reason, we are not aware of a global checklist that is publicly available that does use the PSC. But one estimate in 2016 was that there would be over 18,000 bird species if you use the PSC, and others have estimated even more. Anyway, so we're using the BSC, the approach that has been used by other checklists, and we nevertheless use an integrative taxonomic approach that, whenever possible, and that's now possible most of the time, includes information on genetic divergence and relationships, as well as often large samples of vocalizations that weren't available before. And in some cases, we also have information on whether birds are parapatric or sympatric, and I'll get to what that is, what those are in a moment if you're not familiar with those terms, and their ecology in some cases and behavior in some cases. Those are not the primary sources of decision making for species concepts, but they can be relevant. And as of the first version, the 2025 version of AviList, we recognize 11,131 species. We know that this is not the endpoint, that we know of many, many cases where there is certain to be more species, and in some cases where lumps will happen, but there is most likely to be more species than 11,131 that will eventually be recognized. There won't be an actual endpoint, but that's all we can project. How are genetics used? Well, genetics have become incredibly important in taxonomy. The revolution and the fact that now the whole genome can be sequenced quite rapidly for even for many species is just amazing, and has made a gigantic difference in avian taxonomy as well as other fields. But we cannot just use genetics as the sole basis. We have to use it along with other sorts of information. And what we can say, though, is that if genomic data show that 2 taxa are not as closely related to each other as they are to another taxon, they cannot be the same species. That's a basic fact of how we can interpret genetics. We can also say that in most cases, if we have deep genetic divergence between 2 taxa, they are probably, but not certainly, separate species. So we need to look at those data in combination with other kinds of data. We also need to know that if you have a shallow genetic divergence, that does not necessarily mean that they are not separate species, but it means that they very likely could be, but other sorts of data need to be brought to bear on the question. We can't just use an arbitrary cutoff point. For one thing, different genes evolve at different speeds, and so do species. So it's much more complicated than that. But to boil it down, that's all we'll say for now. And we also know that we expect to see cases that aren't readily determined. It's not easy to determine whether they're species or not, because evolution works that way. It's a gradual process. It's happening all around us. It's not at some endpoint just because of the time that we live in now. So we expect to see different stages of speciation. And one that I'm working on right now is the great egret, which has been needing to be examined taxonomically for many, many years. Everyone knows, quote unquote everyone, that the American great egret has different soft part colors and a different call than the old world ones. But it turns out to be much more complicated than that. We unfortunately don't have sufficient genetic information to put the whole picture together. Nothing from the African taxon is the main problem. But what we do know is that it's not so easy. It's not just a divergence between New World and Old World. It's much more divergence within the Old World as well. So this is where more work on genetics is still needed, and there are many, many such examples. Okay, how do we use vocalizations? And again, we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to be real quick about this, but we can use stereotyped vocalizations very, very well in helping to determine species limits. We have to make sure that they are homologous, that they are the same type of vocalization used in the same context. And in many cases, they are constant enough to allow us to make taxonomic judgments. But we have to remember that some birds have dialects, and individual variation, complexity and mimicry, etc., means that it's not necessarily straightforward, but it can be. This is an example of the Himalayan population and the South Indian population are dramatically different in their acoustic signals, not just the calls, but also the drum rolls. And that's been shown in a recent paper to be the case. We also can use some aspects of geographic ranges to help establish species limits. For example, if two taxa occur together in the same area during the breeding season without interbreeding or with very little interbreeding, then they're what we call sympatric, meaning occurring together, and by definition, they're a separate species. If two taxa occur in adjacent areas that don't have major geographic barriers, but have very little or no interbreeding, then we call them parapatric. So here we have an example of a parapatric pair of taxa. They're not split yet, except by BirdLife, also by AviList. And they are, so this one has a up slurred song, up ending song. This one has a down ending song and different amounts of black in the hood of the male. And they come together right here in Venezuela. And anyway, it's still a work in progress, but we can pretty much assume that these are parapatric and probably should be considered separate species. If they are allopatric or don't occur together, then we can't use direct evidence, but we can often infer whether they would interbreed or not, especially if playback experiments are possible. And if they interbreed regularly in the wild, like flickers do, we've got our two parental species that look very, very different, but all sorts of intermediates over a very broad range in North America. We cannot justify calling these separate species, much as we would like to. Okay, how about peer-reviewed literature? Well, of course we want to use peer-reviewed scientific papers. They're the gold standard. That's what we want to base our taxonomic decisions on. But each one of those generally takes years and sometimes decades. And often a lot of investment, a lot of money is involved in the sequencing, et cetera, and time. And now we have massive amounts of ancillary data types publicly available. Anyone can use these and even do their own analyses of taxonomy quite easily. So we can often use these data sources to supplement published research. And we can even consider that when a committee is scrutinizing these types of data, that this is equivalent in some ways to peer review. We also plan to make other rationales that we use to supplement published information for AviList publicly available soon. That's an important point that I think Marshall's going to get to. I have a few examples. This one is just, again, I'm running out of time, so I'll gloss over it a bit. But here we have two very different looking parrots that were split by BirdLife. Deep divergence, but turns out their vocalizations are very similar. When we looked at the large number of photos from Panama, especially, we found all manner of intermediates. And this needs to be analyzed more carefully, but it doesn't support the separate species hypothesis. Here's another example of how the media archives can really play a huge role. When I wrote a book on birds of South Asia, I noted that they sounded different. This one sounded different in Thailand than in India, but I didn't have enough data at that time. Now there's been a wonderful paper published by Berryman et al. Showing that in Thailand, they have a distinctive red iris, and the female contribution to the duet is quite different. So it's a clearly different species. I couldn't be sure of that when I wrote my book. Here's our monumental split of the island thrush. This is one that I would say everyone who's worked on this bird or thought about this bird knew was coming, but finally Reeve et al. Published a phylogeny that included I think all the forms, or almost all the sorry, not quite, but almost all the forms, and gave us a backbone. And I did this color scheme to match the phylogeny, showing the various patches. There's repeating themes of plumage. And one island group, Fiji, has 5 different major color patterns, but they're all closely related. So it's the morphology of the plumage is simply not correlated with the phylogeny, because this is what those Fiji birds look like on the phylogeny, all clustered together. There's more to be done here, but this is a big start. All right, so generic changes. Here's an example of a recent paper by Katanek et al. Showing conclusively something that we had a pretty good idea was coming down the pike, but we didn't have the data to make the final decisions. And that is that Circus, the harriers, is embedded within the former accipiter. And so are a bunch of other taxa that are not very similar and always been considered separate genera. And there just is no justification for maintaining them all in accipiter unless you were to lump all these other taxa in accipiter, which makes very little sense. So we now have 5 genera of the former accipiter, plus actually 6 because of the tiny hawk. Okay, and then to finish my part and hand it over to Marshall, a little bit about linear sequence. So we do have linear sequence that is based on formerly based on morphology, now based on molecular phylogenies, and it's a standardized representation of the list in 2 dimensions. Sorry, a standardized representation of the phylogeny in 2 dimensions. So we have to use certain conventions where we have ties, etc. And we also have a complete dynamic tree of all birds that just came out a few weeks ago. Martin Sturbander has done some amazing work in doing a lot of sequencing, linear sequencing, that is, for AviList. And there's plans to automate this process eventually when we get this all worked out. All right, I'll turn it over to Marshall.
Okay, I'm going to go real quick to try to get us to questions. So for phase 2, we're really going to try to dive in on species questions that were not part of these incongruences, that didn't differ between the checklists. So one example is the orange minivet, which is the southern India Sri Lankan bird, and the scarlet minivet complex. That hasn't been worked out yet, largely because there's all these differences within scarlet minivet that are also species level differences. So it's a complex problem that Pam is really excited to dive into. The Paradise Kingfisher example down below is something recently published that may split the current common Paradise Kingfisher into 6 species. So we want to keep our eyes on incoming data for sure. A bunch of other things that we're hoping for in phase 2. Our next annual update will probably be in September of 2026. That will begin the process of reconciling subspecies, layer in some additional taxonomic information like subgenera, subfamilies, maybe subspecies groups. It'll include even more extensive range information. Currently, we don't provide ranges for polytypic species. Those will be added in. We really want to improve the transparency of this process. The last 4 or 5 years have basically been like Pam and Paul and Marshall and the executive team and the taxonomic team in a rabbit hole trying to resolve this without the level of communication, because there was so much uncertainty about sort of where we would land. Now that we're out, we really believe transparency is really important. So that means publish the decision making that guided phase one. That'll be coming out this fall. Add a new system to transparently list the proposals and issues being considered. Really, that would follow the IOC model, which I think is a leader in sort of being really public and forthright about what's being considered. And then really ramp up these regional advisory groups and the public. So public will be able to send proposals and have those go through the regional advisory and taxcom groups. And then we'll be sort of improving what's available on the website, which includes sort of other versions of the list, more information about things. English names. I've been doing the chat, and there's all these questions about English names, and people really worked up about that. So our view and my view and the view of eBird, it is okay to have more than one name for a bird, more than one common name. It's really important to have one scientific name. So Contopus sordidulus is western wood pewee. Here on the right, Impidnex retii is gray flycatcher. But you may prefer western wood pewee without a hyphen instead of with a hyphen. IOC uses it without, Clements uses it with, AOS uses it with a hyphen, AviList uses it without a hyphen. You can customize this in eBird. You can set IOC names, or you can set sort of eBird compliant names. There's a bigger difference on the right. Gray is spelled with an E instead of an A, and it's called American gray flycatcher to distinguish it from African gray flycatcher. But people that are long familiar with the AOS name would know it as gray flycatcher, and that's what I know it as, and that's what eBird uses. So English names differ around the world. In eBird, you can go to the preferences page, URLs at the top left there, and you can pick Australian English, Bangladesh, Hawaiian, HBW/BirdLife, Hong Kong, India, IOC, Kenya, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, South Africa, UK, United Arab Emirates, or United States. Those all have minor differences. They're largely the same for most birds in the world, but some of them are going to spell gray with an A, some with an E. Some of them are going to use black petrel for Procelaria parkinsoni, and some are going to use Parkinson's petrel. We do expect the AviList team to continue to sort of carry forward the IOC naming structure, and we do have an English names team that will be trying to bring as much concordance to English names as possible. But this reality of gray plover being used in the UK and black-bellied plover in the US, we are not trying to like fight this out and resolve it. It is okay. And you can see above and below this list, eBird also supports Chinese, Croatian, Czech, Danish, Dutch, Faroese, Finnish, French, multiple versions of French, multiple versions of Spanish. So these are all the names that we have for barn swallow. We just added Kyrgyzstan name last week for barn swallow. So we're constantly working with translators in other countries to make sure that common names for birds are expressed in the names that are familiar for people. And so this reality of multiple common names for a single species applies all over the world in all different languages, all different scripts. Some which read left to right, some which read right to left, and it is okay. AviList uses Hirundo rustica. That is the scientific name that we're trying to focus on agreement for. That said, like we do have a group that is recommending an English name, and the list also publishes the English name basically using IOC criteria. That is the AviList name going forward, using eBird Clements and using BirdLife. And those have some differences, especially on hyphenation, spelling of gray, and capitalization rules. So how's this going to affect eBird? And the big answer is it really won't. eBird has been doing taxonomic updates in October for the past several years. In August we've been doing annual updates since I joined in 2007. That will continue. So AviList and eBird, Birds of the World, and Merlin are already in greater than 99% alignment with AviList. That's because during this 5-year process, we have been gradually stepping closer and closer, and we're going to complete that process in the next year, basically. So this coming update will be 99.35% compliant on species limits and 99.85 on scientific names. And we expect that to be nearly 100% in 2026, maybe actually 100%. We will still need to publish sort of the birders taxonomy that includes hybrids, spuds, slashes, domestics, undescribed species. These are all things that bird watchers encounter in the field. We collect data for and are really important. It's really important to be able to say, I saw a sharp-shinned / Cooper's hawk. And that is not a formal taxon in AviList, but it's really important for eBird. The updates for eBird will still occur in October, including this coming October. We will still convert the eBird checklist, maps, photos, sounds. Now we have to convert all the Merlin photo ID recognition and sound ID recognition. We have to convert all the data that drives those also. And Birds of the World accounts are updated manually by hand by a huge team of authors every year to keep up with this. That is not going to change. It's going to be the same thing. And your personal records that you've submitted to eBird will also automatically update. One thing we really hope to provide either this year or next will be a personalized report that we'll send through your email. So make sure your email preferences allow us to send you an email that will summarize, like, here's what changed in your life list. And that'll be a much easier way for people to check what happened. So that's something we really hope to add this year or next year. And I'm just going to close with one that's coming down the pike this year. The AOS considered a proposal to split warbling vireo. There's good information on genetics, vocalizations. They differ in molt timing. They nearly come in contact, so we can assess hybridization. Here on the left, we have eastern warbling vireo. Here on the right, we have an absolutely visually identical bird, western warbling vireo, slightly darker in the crown, slightly smaller bill, slightly different molt timing. But down below, you can see the song difference, and eastern warbling has sort of this rollicking, slurred song with a rise at the end, and western warbling just looks totally different on the sonogram, and that is one of the important things that we think the species use for recognition. So here's my life list of warbling vireo sightings, and here's what's going to happen in eBird. We're going to go assign these ones to eastern. They're from Massachusetts and New Jersey, places where only eastern warbling vireo is known during the breeding season. Then there's some that we're going to assign to western. So Nevada, the wintering population in Jalisco, Mexico, probably will go into western. Then there's some that we may not be able to assign. Birds in the migratory period in the Dakotas and the West, where these two things almost come into contact, those might end up as eastern / western. That is just the fact of the matter when you have birds that nearly come into contact and look as similar as these ones do. This one I sort of highlight. This is a November one I had in Massachusetts. That could as easily be a vagrant western as an eastern one. So just because it's in Massachusetts, it's so far outside the migration timing that one will probably end up as a slash unless I can work out which one's shown in the photos. I did not hear it sing. And then this is where the subspecies groups that are available in eBird come in. If you've already put it in as a western, we'll flip that over to the species. So the subspecies group that exists in eBird currently for warbling vireo eastern and warbling vireo western are a 1-to-1 match for the species, and so the conversion is very easy when birders have assigned them that way. And I'm just going to close with one of these great migration maps. So this is from the eBird status and trends, and this shows the migration of warbling vireo coming up into the country, spending the summer here, migrating back to Mexico and Middle America for the winter. Do it one more time. You can actually start to see on here that there's a difference in habitat. The rivers really highlight on the eastern birds, and the mountains really highlight on the western birds. So here that is static, breeding range in red, winter range in blue. You can really see those river corridors, the Platte River, the Missouri River popping out as breeding habitat for eastern warbling vireo. And basically the process will be to sort of subdivide the range like this, assign the records accordingly, have a lot of room for slashes in migration and in some of the Middle American wintering grounds. And the new picture, this may be the last time you see that animation, because by November we will be reworking this, and by the following year when the new status and trends comes out with the new data, it will have these species split. So that's the process, and that sort of summarizes the importance of AviList.
Awesome. Thank you all so much, panelists. We do have about 20 minutes left for a few questions. So if you are watching right now and you have a question for Pam, Paul, or Marshall, please put it in the Q&A section so that we can see it. So we can just jump in to our first question. So question for our panelists. Someone in the Q&A section wrote, I'm curious to understand how consensus was reached among the various organizations involved in AviList. Could you please share the methodology or decision-making process used to align different taxonomic viewpoints to create this unified global checklist?
Can I go there?
Sure.
Yeah, I can see Marshall's busy typing, but Marshall, I think, showed the front page of a scientific paper that's been published recently, and the whole process is laid out in great detail there. And I think, Marshall and Pam, that paper is still free to view for a while yet.
It
Through
is July and August. Yep.
Right, so you can download that paper and it will give you all the details. But in short, it was a voting process. It was decided by majority vote. We used a GitHub site, and where we differed slightly from the way that AOS, NAC and SAC reached their votes, is that we could see each other's comments before making the vote, rather than their system of reading a proposal and voting independently. So there was a kind of bit of backwards and forwards, and people would often change their vote in the light of what somebody posted. So there's also, if you download AviList, you'll see that all the cases that we voted on, there's a little summary statement there, a little taxonomic statement explaining why we reached the decision that we did. But read the paper, because it's the whole process is laid out very clearly in there.
And
Awesome.
to add to that, the decisions were based on a simple majority rather than the 2/3 majority required by NAC and SAC for a change.
Awesome. I have a follow-up question to that. So these decisions on what is or isn't a species can have pretty big implications for conservation, especially for rare and endangered species. So there were a couple questions in the Q&A about asking, how are you making sure that local authorities and conservation organizations in different regions of the world have a say in these decisions?
Again, shall I go first? I think Marshall said it very neatly, that the sort of first round of voting was kind of done behind not exactly closed doors, but it was done by a single group of people, because our aim was to sort of bring consistency to it. But Marshall, or I can't remember, either Marshall or Pam, also noted that we are busy now establishing regional subcommittees, and we're absolutely committed at some point in the future to democratizing the process still further by perhaps setting up public forums whereby people can comment on things, can suggest changes, can complain about changes that have been made. So the idea is to sort of try and open the process up. It has been a bit sort of behind closed doors so far, but that was just to get the first draft out of the door. And we've got various ideas for how we can kind of bring a greater contribution in from the world generally. I don't know if Marshall or Pamela want to add to that.
I think that covers it. I'm trying to type some answers as we go, so.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question about common names and making information available in different languages. Someone noted that the IOC list included a multilingual version, which was very helpful for regions outside of the English-speaking world. And they're wondering if there are resources or checklists available in languages other than English.
Yeah, so I can take that one. I think our hope is that the existing process that eBird, Birds of the World, are using to connect with committees in different countries and individuals that are providing translated names country by country, that is already feeding into AviList. So as the taxa align, those names become relevant for every country around the world. We have something like 105 different languages available in eBird, which, like I said, includes Kyrgyzstan as of last week, and some others coming online in August. So that process is really engages birders in these different countries that speak totally different languages. The fact that that feeds into eBird, I think, will provide even more extensive sets of names than IOC currently does. So I think the eBird Birds of the World process is going to fill that really well. And those names are now available. If you go to Birds of the World and click names next to that, you see all the possible names for barn swallow or herring gull or anything. So yeah, like I think by bringing these together and having these groups supporting, then the real strengths of those groups, whether it's sort of IUCN and red list assessment and conservation minded focus that BirdLife brings, or sort of the connection with the global eBird community and common name translations from eBird Birds of the World become strengths rather than frustrations.
Awesome. And a follow-up question to that one. There are a couple questions about how does AviList, if at all, impact the current ABA efforts to rename birds in the United States that are named after people?
Yeah, so I think that fits in the same vein. I think I know that AOS now has a pilot group being formed to assess six names that were part of their suggested pilot study. So that may lead to changes in Scott's Oriole and Bachman Sparrow and Maui Parrotbill and a few others, Inca Dove. And when those happen, those will either sort of bring a new consensus, or people will have an option to choose an eponymous or non-eponymous name in the same sort of alternate English name structure that we have today. So I really think it will nothing's being imposed on everyone. People will have some choice to use the long-standing familiar name or the new non-eponymous names that come out of AOS.
Awesome. Maybe a question for Pam. There were a couple questions in the chat about like how exactly do you decide what is a species? There were some questions about a trait scoring system that was mentioned, like what criteria when assessing a species are weighted more than others, if anything. Is there a certain like algorithm that you use for every single species to try to decide what is and isn't a species? Or is it different for each bird, and what is actually available?
Well, I'll say I wish there was an algorithm, but we do, everything is, many things are a judgment call, and different people will make different judgment calls. I want to say something about the trait scoring system. So this was adopted based on the paper that was published about by Tobias et al. About this use of a 7-point scoring system. And then it was applied broadly to many taxa that were considered taxonomically uncertain by BirdLife when they were doing the checklist of, I forget the exact, HBW BirdLife checklist, which is a magnificent set of volumes, by the way, extremely useful. And it led to the recognition of, I don't remember the number, but a few hundred species that hadn't been considered species before. And that was part of the reason for the alignment process. And it actually was very, very illuminating in providing the rationales and also just the impetus to reconsider these issues. So many of those were considered to be separate species. Many were considered to be not sufficiently different in enough ways to be clearly separate species as well. So, and many others were considered to be in need of further work. So in many cases, we realize, as I mentioned earlier, that there have to be more than one species in what is now considered one species, based on the vocal variation, the genetic variation, etc. But we don't have enough information to make that decision. And so one point of disagreement among practitioners is whether to make a few change, one change that needs to be made And even though there's multiple that should be made, but you don't have enough information to do it on a solid basis, or whether to wait for a complete publication that really answers all the questions. Frankly, you never get a publication that answers all the questions. Every publication raises more questions, but they do, some do answer a lot of the questions. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there is a variation among people that work in taxonomy as to how they would, what they would consider the sufficient evidence for species status. I tend to be more on the side of if it differs in a number of ways, and including like vocalizations and genetics and morphology, then it's better to consider it a species than to wait for forever or decades maybe for a paper that says the same thing. So not everyone agrees, and that's fine. I hope I answered the question to somewhat, but yes, I wish there was an algorithm. It's not that simple. And we don't expect it to be that simple because of, as I mentioned, how evolution works.
Awesome. Marshall, there's a bunch of questions from folks asking how they can find out about the latest taxonomic updates, especially related to their eBird list. What is the best resource for these people to be looking at, and when can they expect to see updates?
So eBird every year when taxonomy changes in eBird Merlin Birds of the World, we publish a detailed story that outlines all the changes. These tend to be very long stories, so it takes a lot of sifting through to see those. I mentioned that we're hoping either this year or next to be able to send a customized email to all users about what actually changed on their list as part of this process. So hopefully that will provide much better information. Nothing's changing in eBird until October, so there's nothing to see until that happens. For AviList, we, like I said, we're trying to adopt the IOC model to show what cases are being considered for a given cycle. So for the upcoming update to AviList in fall 2026, we are going to start posting the issues being considered fairly soon. So
awesome, thank you. This is a question maybe for Paul. There were a bunch of questions about how and when and if other conservation organizations or authorities around the world will be adopting this AviList taxonomy. So the specific question was, do BirdLife affiliates and partners all adopt the same taxonomy as BirdLife International?
The great majority of BirdLife partners don't explicitly follow any specific taxonomy, but pretty much all of them will follow it in the sense that they will look to the red list for guidance on which are the most threatened species. So they implicitly rather than explicitly follow the BirdLife taxonomy when it comes to globally threatened species, at least. Some BirdLife partners have largely followed the BirdLife taxonomy, but differ in one or two ways where they feel strongly that BirdLife's got it wrong, and that there's something that we regard maybe as a subspecies that they regard as a subspecies and it's in trouble, and they want to regard it as a species. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that question. But given that the red list, the IUCN red list underpins so much of species conservation, and given that the red list is essentially what the taxonomy that BirdLife is using at the time, then I guess that is the default conservation, the default checklist for people working in the field of conservation.
Awesome, thank you. And kind of a follow-up question to that, there were questions on whether the Canadian Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or other government agencies will be adopting this list as well.
I'm sorry, I don't know. I think one of my North American colleagues had better answer that one.
all right, I was furiously doing the chat. If people are waiting for me to respond, can you say the question again?
Yeah. Our a couple questions that I'm lumping all into one. Will like CITES and the Red List and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Canadian Wildlife Service, other government agencies, are they all planning to adopt this AviList taxonomy as well?
We don't No, AviList has only been out for a month. I think the process of sort of building those types of partnerships is going to take a bit longer. What I can say is that a lot of those currently use NAC, the AOS North American Classification Committee, and AviList and eBird are highly aligned with NAC. Not 100% aligned, but a real goal here has been to maximize that alignment and to Pam sits on not only the IOC team and the eBird Clements team and the AviList team and the AOS NAC team. And that type of involvement is helping us to stay in sync. So we're trying to have the same issues considered on the same schedules and ideally assessing the same information and ideally arriving at the same conclusions. So the whole process is working vastly better than it ever has before. That said, like there may be slight differences between those that will occasionally create some challenges for agencies. But for the most part, if you're following NAC, you're pretty much following AviList. If you're following AviList, you're pretty much following Clements. If you're following Clements, you're pretty much following NAC. So it's like we've really managed to bring these things into very, very close marriage, and not 100% yet, but I sure would like to see a world in 5 or 10 years that is truly 100% around the world, and agencies aren't tasked with like, do I pick this one or this one, but I just use the global piece. So so we've sort of put out a proposal. The proposal is like, we have this process. We believe it to be representative, transparent, open, better, current. And I think now there are a number of groups around the world that are looking at it and saying like, is it everything that they promise it is? And if it is, then I'll use it. And if it's not, then you know, we may continue to live in this world with differences between groups, but hopefully those differences will be much, much smaller. So
I want to stress one thing that I don't think we have enough, and that is that we really want to make it clear where further taxonomic research is needed. We really want to say indicate, you know, where people can contribute and end up with a, you know, so that we can end up with a better final list. So yeah, so like the decision summaries that are published in AviList very, very frequently indicate, you know, more genetic work, more work on vocalizations is needed, et cetera. So that's one thing that we're very, very interested in promoting. And the regional advisory group structure is going to help a lot with that. But also public feedback will be very, very important.
Awesome. And that leads me to our final question that we have time for, which is there a way for anyone watching today to get involved and help out?
So I think the real vision is that we will have a fairly streamlined process for proposals to be brought to the attention of the regional groups to be like sort of either sort of approved and added to by those regional groups and sent up to the taxonomic committee, or potentially sent back and said like this doesn't quite lay the case out as well as we would need to. So the hope is to involve the public, involve the regional groups in proposals that would change the classification or nomenclature, and to have that feed right in. So I think that's the area where public involvement is could be most helpful. Certainly, like if anyone spots any error in the list, we want it to be as error-free as possible. We do have an errata section on there. It has a few entries already. Those are all my fault that we missed a few, but there were something like many hundreds of thousands of data fields, and we want to be as transparent as possible when we get the gender ending of tachyspiza something or other wrong. We put that out publicly to say this can be corrected going forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answers to these questions, and thank you again to our 3 panelists for this incredible webinar. But we are at the end of our 90 minutes that we have today. But if you want to keep learning, we have a couple exciting webinars coming up in the next few months. In September, if you want to learn about lost birds, we have Alex Berryman and John Mittermeier coming to speak about that. In October, we have Dr. Charles Brown speaking about aerial insectivores. And in November, if you're still really excited about taxonomy, we will have the Birds of the World taxonomy team coming on to speak about new changes in the world of taxonomy later in November. You can find all of these dates and times on the Birds of the World website. You can register there. To everybody watching, the recording of this webinar will be released next week. It will also be available on the website. Thank you all again so much. Thank you again to the panelists.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful rest of your day.